Britain has been no stranger to operations in the Far East throughout history. For example, Sir Francis Drake's arrival in the late 1570s, which can be considered a foreshadow to the later arrival of British imperialism to the region. The establishment of settler colonies, like Australia, as well as the formation of key strategic outposts acquired by Britain, such as Singapore, Hong Kong and Bombay, gave the Royal Navy vast amounts of influence in policing the region and chiefly protecting vital trade routes to British India and other colonial settlements. Additionally, these naval bases proved vital for staging the British Eastern Fleet in its fight against Imperial Japan during the Second World War. However, as the British Empire rapidly receded from the Far East, so too receded the necessity for large military assets in the area, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to justify the cost of maintaining such a global presence amidst the collapse of British global authority. This led to the choice in the mid to late 1960s to finally withdraw units of the British Eastern Fleet, which included cruisers, destroyers, submarines, support vessels and even aircraft carriers such as HMS Eagle, which left Hong Kong in 1968 and symbolised the end of an era in British naval history. In 2009, China submitted a map to the United Nations which outlined Chinese claims to a large portion of the South China Sea. This move caused an increased level of tension in the area due to the fact that this 9-dash line overlaps with claims from various other regional nations such as the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia and Brunei, which has led to disputes over territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the region. But why is this relevant to Britain and the wider world as a whole? Well, in this increasingly globalized world, so much of what we use in the West is imported from other nations. And to put this in perspective, roughly 1/3 of global shipping has to pass through the South China Sea. So the matter of its ownership is heavily a global matter. This coincides with China's rapid naval expansion, which sees China building warships at an unprecedented speed, which can only imply that China is slowly building the means to project naval power offensively and enforce its desired control over the South China Sea and beyond. In 2015, the United States Navy sailed warships through the Chinese claimed waters as part of a freedom of navigation operation, which helped lay the foundations for major tensions between China and the United States and the arms race which has followed. In 2018, the Royal Navy amphibious assault ship HMS Albion left its home of Devonport for the Far East, along with HMS Sutherland, where they went on to visit Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei and Japan, encouraging increased relations with said nations. Furthermore, Albion sailed close to the disputed Paracel Islands, which are claimed by China. In this same year, another warship, HMS Argyle, also deployed to the Indo-Pacific, visiting regional partners and allies such as Australia and New Zealand. In comparison to the years prior to this, which saw virtually zero Royal Navy presence, and certainly not on the scale of 3 large warships in 1 year, as seen in 2018, signified a change in outlook in the Royal Navy policy, provoking the justified assumption that this could be the start of a greater involvement for British naval forces in the region. The Queen Elizabeth class of aircraft carriers were always about power projection, built to enhance the UK's naval capabilities from the previous generation of aircraft carriers. These ships are symbolic of the modern Royal Navy. At the dawn of the 2020s, the British government hinted at the idea of a South China Sea deployment involving a British carrier strike group in the years following. This culminated into CSG-21, which, ignoring workup trials and test operations, was the first operational debut of HMS Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Elizabeth class of aircraft carriers as a whole. The Royal Navy is not without its critics, but I think it's undeniable of the success of the deployment. Queen Elizabeth would lead a task force of 2 Type 45 destroyers, 2 Type 23 frigates, 1 Astute-class attack submarine, 1 Tide-class fleet tanker, the auxiliary ship RFA Fort Victoria, as well as the American destroyer the USS The Sullivans and the Dutch frigate HNLMS Evanston, through the world's seas and oceans towards the South China Sea, all the while conducting various operations and port visits, stopping in 40 different nations over the course of the deployment, including India, Japan, Singapore, Korea, as well as the American naval base at Guam. a monumental achievement showing the flag as well as encouraging trade deals and increased defense cooperations with many nations. CSG-21 has proved that such a deployment is not only possible, but it actually works really well in sending a message and cementing a presence in the region. After all, CSG-21 was the first time in quite some decades that the Royal Navy had committed such a large contingency to such a far-flung region of the world. In September of 2021, whilst Britain's carrier strike group was still on deployment, 2 offshore patrol vessels, HMS Spey and HMS Tamar, left Portsmouth for the Indo-Pacific. They were to be based there permanently for 5 years, conducting various operations in the region. This was the first time Royal Navy ships were stationed in this corner of the world since the 1997 Hong Kong handover. But it's important to mention that these aren't combat vessels, they are patrol ships, armed with nothing more than a 30mm cannon, which has come under criticism for many for being a waste of time, money and resources whilst getting very little in return. While I admit the 2 patrol ships aren't exactly projecting the power a frigate or destroyer could, you must remember that that is not the point of this deployment. This is a stepping stone, for the Royal Navy hasn't operated permanently so far from home in such a long time, and it makes sense for me to slowly work up to this with smaller scale deployments of offshore patrol vessels, and then later in the future this can be upscaled with larger assets such as a frigate, which are more capable of combat operations. Regardless, the 2 ships had provided a permanence and constancy in the region, which has allowed operations with allies in the region to commence over the course of the several-year-long deployment, as well as filling roles like anti-crime operations, fishery protection and humanitarian aid, which makes sense for an OPV like Tamar and Spey, but would be overkill for a billion-pound destroyer. CSG-25 can be considered the prequel to CSG-21. This is an upcoming deployment this year which will include the Royal Navy's second carrier, HMS Prince of Wales, as well as a task force of escorting warships. The exact layout of this task force has not yet been confirmed, but it is not yet certain whether this deployment will be able to match the number of units present in the CSG-21 deployment made by HMS Queen Elizabeth. This could be due to a variety of factors, such as a hesitation to over-deploy too many assets halfway across the world, when tensions are already so high close to home in European waters, as well as the fact that the Royal Navy doesn't have all too many ships available right now, due to refits and decommissionings. I think this underlies a major issue in the Royal Navy, and the whole Pacific focus, as the past shows with the fatal deployment of 2 capital ships to the Far East during the Second World War. These things have to be fought out well, and more importantly, there needs to be the foundations to support them. What I mean by this is that if the government does not approve sufficient funding to build enough warships, then there quite simply won't be enough units to support major operations globally whilst upholding defensive operations close to home. This is a major commitment, and one the Royal Navy is certainly capable of, but it needs to have the numbers to do so. It generally depends how much of a commitment the Royal Navy is expecting of itself in these coming decades, and it's a question which goes far beyond one category. Time will tell how the future of this Indo-Pacific tilt will affect the composition of the future Royal Navy, and how it will influence British foreign policy and relations with nations around the world. It's clear that the Royal Navy is only getting started with its Pacific tilt, and we will have to wait for the future to see how this will fully unfold. What's certain for now at least is that it is important the Royal Navy is seen supporting our Pacific allies as well as the United States Navy in the combined issues we face in this turbulent world. The CSG-25 deployment is set to begin sometime around April of this year. I personally would like to wish the best of luck to all who are involved. Thank you for watching.